All right, Jackson Katz is here, anti-sexist activist, author, and expert on violence, media, and masculinity. Also somebody that I know from taking classes with Sut Jolly and having him show all sorts of different documentaries. He made you somewhat, I don't know if I'd say a star, but a well-known figure at the University of Massachusetts. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I've been reading a lot of your Huffington Post stuff. I've been looking at some of the topics from your upcoming book. And I'm interested to talk. Your expertise covers a broad range of specific areas we could focus on. But I'd love to talk about the presidency, the Tea Party, the 2012 election, and kind of where you see gender, masculinity fitting in there. But to get into that, it might be good to step back and say, over the last 10, 15 years, what has been the role of gender in politics, elections, kind of as an overall picture?
Well, sure. Well, when most people hear the word gender and politics together, they assume that it's a discussion about women and women's political choices or women's voting patterns or women as candidates. And of course, those are all important issues. But the focus of my work has been on looking at how men are gendered beings and how men's political choices and men as candidates are gendered as well. And that's a discourse that I think is incredibly important in American politics and presidential politics specifically that rarely gets discussed. And so the lens that I use, if you will, to look at the last 30, 40, 50, 100 years of American politics, certainly in the media era, is the gendered lens looking at men and masculinity. And my basic point is that gender is always an issue in presidential politics. It's always an issue. But only when a woman is running, like when Hillary Clinton was running for the Democratic nomination in 2008, do people actually talk about gender. But even when two men are running against each other, gender is a central force in presidential politics.
And it's just interesting you mentioned usually when someone says gender, you're thinking of women. And I think this applies when there's discussions of race. I think people's minds go to either black people or brown people, Hispanic people, what have you. When there's a discussion of class, your thought goes to poor people.
Right. Well, what you're describing is how dominance functions by stealth or invisibility. And so making visible what has been rendered invisible is one of the most, I think, important progressive projects, whether it's in politics about racism or heterosexism or sexism. Making the dominant group visible and examining the mechanisms by which it maintains its dominance is a key, it's a key act of, progressive transformation. Even issues as ranging as prostitution and sex trafficking. It's looking at instead of looking at the supply side, like the prostitutes, you look at the demand side. The demand side meaning men who are buying sex. This is all of this is about shifting focus off of the subordinated groups or the oppressed, if you will, groups, and looking critically at the dominant group and how it maintains its privilege.
So to be really specific, when we think back to the 2008 election, after it became clear that Hillary Clinton was not going to be the Democratic nominee, John McCain, Barack Obama, two men, not two white men for once, so that was something a little bit different to start with. Let's be specific about how gender was a factor. I mean, I think many people who will see this will say, okay, I get what you're saying, that when someone says gender, you're thinking of women, and the fact that the two of them are men is also important. How is it a factor? What questions aren't being asked? What aren't we seeing in the media? Let's get into it.
Sure. Well, the first thing I think that I look at in my work, and I think it's really fundamental and basic, is that there is a persistent gender gap in voting patterns in the United States, and among white men in particular. White men have been voting radically disproportionately for the Republican nominee for president for the last 40 years. And in working class white men, there's different ways of defining working class, but with a high school education, men with a high school education voted in 2000 for George Bush by something like 27 points over Al Gore. And Kerry, about 25% voted for Bush over Kerry in 2004. Barack Obama cut into that pretty significantly in 2008, although he still lost the white men's vote.
That's right.
But he lost it by about 16 percentage points. So he made some significant inroads into the white men's vote. But if you look at white male voting patterns, the only way the Democrat can win at the national level in the presidency is if they win such a dramatic percentage of the women's vote that it offsets their deficit among the white male vote.
That's right.
And so how can we not talk about gender? Why are white men so dramatically voting for the Republican candidate for president? Now, some people, of course, since the Civil Rights Act, have been talking about race as one of the central forces subtextually at work in presidential politics.
And it's being talked about looking forward also because of the increasing Hispanic population and how that will play a factor.
That's right. And of course, Obama being an African-American that brought to the surface a lot of discussions about race and politics and such that had always been there, but they were talked about even more explicitly. Would white people vote for an African American for president, et cetera? My thinking is that it's not just that white men are voting as a racialized bloc for the Republican candidate, although that's a big part of it. They're also voting in a gender sense as men, because especially since the late 60s and early 70s, and then increasingly after the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, the way that the two-party system has been sort of shaken out, if you will, in the gender binary is the Republican Party is the party of real men,
right,
and the Democratic Party is the party of women and feminized men. And that has heterosexist implications as well,
sure,
because the Democratic Party is seen as the party of gay rights, if you will, in addition to the men in the Democratic Party feminized in the national discourse. And I think this is a cultural political analysis, right? I think that this is an incredibly important reason why lots of white men, including working and middle-class white men, vote against their economic interests, at least as some of us understand those economic interests.
No question about it.
Right. So this is complicates the analysis of, say, Thomas Frank and others who have been trying to figure out why so many Americans, especially white Americans, have voted against their economic interests for the past generation.
You mentioned the issue of gay rights, and we saw that really incredibly directly and just at the forefront in the discussion of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I mean, I interviewed people who said the reason we shouldn't have homosexuals serving openly in the military is because the American military is manly. And implicit in that, even though it's not discussed, is that there's something bad about femininity and women in the military. And when I challenged some of those people directly, it was made very clear that that is involved in that subtext, just barely underneath the surface. But other than that particular issue, what else is it that has driven this white male voting bloc towards the Republican candidate?
In my book that I'm working on and just about to complete, I look at 3 issues. There's so many issues, and so you have to really narrow it. But
or the major ones,
yes,
maybe.
Yeah, sure. I looked at 3 issues that all involve violence, and they all involve important political issues over the past 40, 50 years. The first one is the Cold War. The second one is the rise of street crime as a domestic political issue in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, and the discussion about violent crime, street crime, has a definitely racialized undertone to it. And then the rise of terrorism as a political issue in the late 20th century and into the 21st century. All 3 of those issues, Cold War, domestic crime, and terrorism, have to do with violence. And the president is a stand-in a certain sense, the symbolic leader of the country. He embodies, if you will, the national masculinity in a very important sense. People talk about the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the mourner-in-chief when national tragedy happens, the first family. He's the one who everybody salutes to and everybody stands when he enters the room. He really does, in a certain sense, represent the country.
And how can we